Can't you answer when people are talking to you?" The man's voice cut through the crowded Chicago restaurant so sharply that Grace Bennett heard it from 3 tables away. She turned just in time to see an elegant, elderly woman sitting alone near the window, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her navy coat folded neatly beside her, confusion softening the lines around her eyes. The woman had not ignored him. She simply had not heard him. But the man did not know that, and worse, he did not seem interested in knowing. He leaned closer, repeated himself louder, then waved both hands inches from her face, while another diner laughed. Someone at the neighboring table copied a few ridiculous hand movements, mocking a language they clearly did not understand. For one ugly moment, Margaret DeLuca became entertainment for strangers who had decided her silence made her less worthy of dignity. Grace felt something tighten inside her chest. She had seen that expression before, the small, careful smile people wore when they were trying to survive humiliation, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing them break. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene. She simply stepped between cruelty and the woman receiving it. She gently lowered the man's hand and said, "Sir, that's enough." Then she turned toward Margaret, and everything about her changed. Her shoulders softened, her smile warmed, and instead of speaking, Grace lifted both hands. "Welcome. I'm glad you're here. May I help you?" Margaret froze. Her eyes widened, as if someone had suddenly opened a door she had stopped believing existed. Then her trembling fingers answered, "You sign?" Grace smiled. "I do." Around them, the restaurant slowly fell quiet, but Grace barely noticed. She crouched slightly beside the table so Margaret would not need to strain her neck, and began explaining the menu with the same patience she would have offered any other customer. The roasted chicken came with garlic potatoes. The tomato basil soup was homemade. The coffee was strong. If Margaret had allergies, Grace wanted to know. There was no exaggerated sympathy in her face, no proud glance around the room to see who might be watching, no performance of kindness. She simply treated Margaret like a woman ordering dinner, not a problem that needed to be solved. For Margaret, that difference meant everything. Dining out had become exhausting over the years. Some servers spoke louder when she could not hear them. Others pointed impatiently at menus. Most meant no harm, but very few understood how lonely it could feel to sit in a crowded room and still be excluded from every conversation around you. Grace understood. When she returned with a steaming bowl of tomato basil soup, she signed, "Careful. It's hot." Margaret smiled. "Thank you, dear." Grace nodded. "Take your time. I'll check on you." She moved away to refill another table's coffee, completely unaware that a tall man in a charcoal suit had stopped near the entrance and had been watching every second. Damien DeLuca had arrived intending to surprise his mother after a late meeting. Instead, he stood perfectly still, observing the waitress who had defended her without asking her name, without knowing her wealth, and without knowing the power attached to the DeLuca family. Damien had hired assistants, translators, private staff, people trained to make Margaret's life easier. Yet too often they treated her carefully instead of naturally, politely instead of warmly. Grace had done neither. She had simply made his mother feel normal again. When Margaret finished dinner, she reached for Grace's wrist and signed, "You gave me something I almost forgot." Grace tilted her head. "What?" Margaret's eyes shimmered. "The feeling that I belong." Grace's expression softened. She squeezed Margaret's hand and answered without hesitation, "You always belong here." Across the room, Damien lowered his gaze for the first time that evening. Those words landed harder than Grace could have known. Outside, beneath the restaurant's glowing sign, Margaret turned to her son and signed with unmistakable determination, "We're coming back tomorrow." Damien glanced through the window at Grace, laughing with another elderly couple. He thought his mother wanted the soup. Margaret smiled knowingly. "No," she signed. "I want you to meet the young woman who still remembers that kindness is a language." And for the first time in years, Damien DeLuca found himself curious about someone who had absolutely no idea who he was. The next evening, Grace was carrying 2 plates toward the dining room when she saw Margaret DeLuca standing near the entrance, smiling as though she had returned to visit an old friend. rather than a waitress she had met only 24 hours earlier. Beside her stood the tall man Grace vaguely remembered seeing near the door the previous night. He wore another perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture controlled enough to make him look slightly out of place among the families and neighborhood regulars filling the restaurant. Margaret waved enthusiastically, then signed, "I told you I would come back." Grace laughed and answered with her hands, "I was hoping you would." Margaret's smile widened before she gestured toward the man beside her. "This is my son, Damien." Grace offered her hand without hesitation. "Nice to finally meet you." Damien looked at her for half a second longer than necessary before taking it. "The pleasure is mine." He could have told her that he had already seen her. He could have explained that he had watched her defend his mother when everyone else either laughed or looked away. Instead, he kept the truth to himself. For once, Damien DeLuca wanted to know how someone would treat him before she knew his name meant anything. Grace led them to Margaret's favorite table by the window and handed Damien a menu. He studied it with the concentration of a man reviewing a multi-million-dollar contract. Grace waited, amused. "Need a recommendation?" He looked up. "What would you choose?" "Tomato basil soup." Damien nodded immediately. "Then I'll have the tomato basil soup. And your main course?" "Roasted chicken." Grace smiled. "Excellent choice." Across the table, Margaret covered her mouth to hide a laugh. She knew her son well enough to know that Damien almost never ordered soup. Yet the following evening, he returned and ordered exactly the same thing. 2 nights later, he returned again. Then again. Same table. Same tomato basil soup. Same roasted chicken. Same black coffee. At first, Grace assumed Margaret was the reason. Then Margaret missed an evening because of a doctor's appointment, and Damien appeared alone. Grace stopped beside his table with her order pad raised. "Let me guess." Damien leaned back. "You seem very confident. Tomato basil soup, roasted chicken, black coffee." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Impressive. It's not impressive when you order the exact same thing every night." "I prefer consistency." "That," Grace said, writing nothing on her pad, "might be the most businessman answer I've ever heard." Damien actually laughed, and Grace caught herself staring for a second. The serious stranger looked unexpectedly younger when he laughed. Warmer, too. Over the next week, their conversations stretched a little longer. Grace began setting his coffee down before he asked. Damien learned that she hated raisins, loved old Motown records, and always stole exactly 1 French fry from the kitchen after the dinner rush. She learned that he disliked unnecessary small talk, remembered every employee's name, and quietly thanked the dishwasher whenever he stayed past closing. One afternoon, Grace arrived carrying 3 sample spoons. Damien eyed them suspiciously. "What is this? An intervention? For what?" She pointed toward his familiar red bowl. "Your unhealthy emotional attachment to one soup." He stared at her. "I wasn't aware this was a problem. Mushroom, potato leek, chicken noodle. Pick one. I already have soup." "Exactly. You have commitment issues." Damien raised an eyebrow. "I'm committed to the tomato soup." Margaret, seated across from him that evening, immediately signed. "She's right." Grace burst out laughing. Damien looked between the 2 women and sighed with theatrical resignation. "I appear to be outnumbered." Soon the regular customers noticed him too. An elderly couple assumed he was a food critic. One server thought he might be an architect. A little boy from a family that came every Thursday began calling him Soup Guy, a nickname Grace adopted with dangerous enthusiasm. What none of them knew was that the quiet man being teased over a bowl of soup was one of Chicago's most powerful businessmen, a man whose decisions could move millions of dollars before breakfast, and whose family name carried influence far beyond the polished offices of DeLuca Enterprises. Grace knew none of that, and Damien discovered that he liked it that way. Around her, he did not have to be Chairman DeLuca. He could simply be Damien, the stubborn customer who refused to try mushroom soup. More importantly, he watched how Grace treated Margaret. Whenever the 2 women signed, Damien never interrupted or demanded a spoken translation. He understood enough American Sign Language to follow much of their conversation, but he allowed them to have something that belonged entirely to them. Grace noticed that small courtesy. She also noticed that she had begun listening for the restaurant door around the time he usually arrived. One rainy Tuesday evening, she placed his coffee beside him and finally asked, "I've been wondering something." Damien looked up. "Should I be concerned?" "Probably. Are you actually addicted to our soup?" He considered the question with absurd seriousness. "I wouldn't call it addiction." "Of course not. The soup brought me here once." Grace smiled triumphantly. "I knew it." But Damien did not smile back. His eyes remained on hers, suddenly quiet, suddenly impossible to read. "But that's not why I keep coming back." Grace waited. For one suspended heartbeat, the noise of the restaurant seemed to disappear around them. Then Damien calmly lifted another spoonful of soup, offering no explanation at all. Grace narrowed her eyes. "Fine. Keep your mysterious secrets, Mr. Soup Guy." She walked away smiling, but the words followed her across the dining room, and as Margaret watched her son watching Grace, she understood something. Neither of them was ready to say aloud. The soup had become an excuse, long before Damien realized he needed one. By the third week, Damien no longer needed to check the time before leaving his office. His mind had already begun traveling toward the little restaurant where Margaret would be waiting, where tomato basil soup would appear without being ordered, and where Grace Bennett would probably find another reason to tease him. But that evening, when he arrived, Grace was not laughing. She was sitting beside Margaret near the window, her hands moving slowly through a conversation. Damien took his customary seat across the room and tried not to listen. Then Margaret signed a question that caught his attention. "You spend so much time taking care of everyone else. Who takes care of you?" Grace smiled automatically. "I'm fine." Margaret raised one eyebrow. Grace laughed. "You remind me of my grandmother." "Then answer me like I'm your grandmother." The humor in Grace's face softened. For a moment, she looked down at the coffee cooling between her hands. When she finally raised them again, her signs were quieter. "I think taking care of people became a habit before I was old enough to understand what it meant." Margaret waited, giving her the kind of silence that invited truth instead of demanding it. Grace drew a breath. "My little brother, Ethan, was born completely deaf." Damien's attention sharpened immediately, though he remained still. Until that moment, he had assumed Grace learned American Sign Language in school. He had never asked. Now the answer opened a door into a childhood she rarely discussed. Grace remembered being 8 years old, standing on a kitchen chair so Ethan could see her hands clearly across the table while their mother cooked dinner after a 12-hour shift. Their father worked nights. Bills crowded the refrigerator beneath magnets, doctor appointments, school notices, birthday invitations, parent-teacher conferences. Everything seemed to arrive written for a world Ethan could not hear. So Grace became the bridge. She learned to sign before she understood how unusual that responsibility was. She translated teachers when they spoke too quickly. She explained medical instructions after appointments. She helped Ethan order cheeseburgers when impatient cashiers looked past him and asked her what he wanted, as though he were invisible. Signing was never a special talent to Grace. It was simply how she loved her brother. Margaret's expression grew tender. That was a lot for a child. Grace shrugged gently. Maybe. But Ethan had the harder job. He had to grow up in a world that kept expecting him to adapt to everyone else. "Did you ever resent it?" Margaret asked. Grace answered. There was no room for doubt. "Never." She glanced toward the rain, darkened window, memories passing behind her eyes. "My brother never asked to be born into a world that made simple things difficult. If learning his language made his life easier, why wouldn't I?" Across the room, Damien lowered his gaze. He had spent years surrounded by people who spoke about accessibility as policy, charity, accommodation, or expense. Grace spoke about it as though the answer were embarrassingly obvious. If someone you loved could not reach the world, you reached toward them. Suddenly, the first night made sense. Grace had not seen a deaf elderly woman who needed rescuing. She had seen Margaret. That was all that mattered. When Grace stood to return to work, she noticed Damien and smiled. "You're quiet tonight, Soup Guy." "Just thinking." "Dangerous hobby." He almost smiled. Then he watched her cross the dining room to help an elderly veteran struggling to read the small print on his menu. Minutes later, She brought crayons to two restless children while their exhausted mother ate. None of it looked rehearsed. None of it asked for recognition. And Damien found himself wondering something he had never wondered about anyone before. Who was Grace Bennett when absolutely no one important was watching? Before the night was over, he would begin to understand the answer. Damien began paying attention to the moments Grace never seemed to notice about herself. Once he understood why she had learned American Sign Language, he expected her kindness toward Margaret to make more sense. What he did not expect was to discover that the same instinct reached almost everyone who crossed her path. The elderly veteran Grace had helped with the menu, returned 2 nights later, without his reading glasses. Grace never mentioned it. She simply pulled a chair closer, read the specials aloud, and waited while he chose between meatloaf and roasted chicken. When a tired mother arrived with 2 restless children, Grace slipped them crayons and paper. When the dishwasher burned his hand, she covered his station while insisting he run it under cold water. None of those gestures were dramatic. Grace never seemed to decide to be kind. She simply noticed what other people needed before the rest of the room noticed they were struggling. One cold evening, a homeless man named Walter appeared near closing. His coat was thin, his shoes worn, and he counted a handful of coins before asking what he could afford. She could have told him the truth. Almost nothing. Instead, she disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a container of roasted chicken, potatoes, bread, and soup. Walter pushed his coins toward her. Grace counted them solemnly, took several, and returned the rest. "Looks like you've got enough." Walter knew. Grace knew. He knew. Neither embarrassed the other by saying it. He thanked her as though he had purchased an ordinary dinner, and she thanked him as though he had left a $100 tip. Damien felt something shift inside him. He had attended charity galas beneath crystal chandeliers, where donors posed beside checks and delivered speeches about compassion. He had signed contributions large enough to fund shelters. Yet Grace had protected something money often overlooked: a man's dignity. There had been no photographer, no applause, no name engraved on a wall. Just food passed across a counter without making the person receiving it feel small. For the first time, he understood why his mother returned home from this restaurant, looking happier than she had after dinners in private rooms. Grace offered no luxury Margaret lacked. She offered the rarest thing in Damien's world: attention without calculation, kindness without a price. Grace noticed Damien watching. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." That was definitely a something face. "I have a something face. Very serious, slightly suspicious. Usually appears right before tomato soup." He smiled. She was moving toward another table. Damien watched her laugh with a couple, then crouch beside a little girl who had dropped her bracelet. Everywhere Grace went, people seemed to leave the interaction standing a little taller than before. His own world operated differently. People became quieter when Damien entered a room. Executives measured their words. Competitors watched his expression. Men, who knew the darker weight carried by the DeLuca name, avoided his eyes entirely. He had spent his life building influence, discipline, and control. Believing power meant changing a room simply by entering it. Grace changed rooms too, but she did it by making people feel safer inside them. And somewhere between watching her retrieve a child's bracelet and hearing her laugh from across the dining room, Damien recognized the truth he had been avoiding. He was falling in love with Grace Bennett, not because she had helped his mother, not because she made him laugh, not even because he found her beautiful. Though he did. He was falling for the woman she remained when there was no reward for being good. Across the restaurant, Vanessa Hill noticed Damien's gaze resting on Grace. The supervisor followed it, then looked at Grace with an expression that hardened almost imperceptibly. Damien did not see it. Grace certainly did not. But while one person had finally begun to recognize the quiet power in Grace's kindness, another had begun to resent how brightly that kindness made her shine. Autumn arrived in Chicago with cold rain, amber leaves, and the restaurant's annual charity dinner, an event Grace normally loved because every dollar raised helped provide free winter meals for seniors and struggling families across the neighborhood. By 6 o'clock, every table was reserved. Fresh flowers stood beside crystal glasses. Local business owners filled the dining room, community leaders exchanged handshakes beneath warm lights, and servers moved between tables in freshly pressed uniforms. Grace had volunteered for the entire evening. She had already worked most of the day, but exhaustion never seemed important when the work meant someone else might eat tomorrow. Vanessa Hill saw the evening differently. As restaurant supervisor, Vanessa had spent days inspecting table settings, correcting uniforms, and reminding employees that important people would be watching. Yet the person everyone kept noticing was Grace. Regular customers greeted her by name. Elderly guests requested her section. Children waved when she passed. Grace did nothing to demand attention, which somehow made the attention she received more infuriating to Vanessa. Then Damien entered with Margaret, and the atmosphere changed. Whispers moved through the room almost immediately. That's Damien DeLuca, the chairman of DeLuca Enterprises? What is he doing here? Grace heard none of it. She saw Margaret first, smiled, and signed, "You look beautiful tonight." Margaret beamed and hugged her. Then Grace glanced at Damien. And Mr. Soup Guy finally wore something respectable. Damien looked down at his tailored suit. Finally? I was beginning to worry. Margaret laughed. Several guests stared in disbelief as one of Chicago's most powerful businessmen allowed a waitress to tease him. Vanessa stared too, but unlike the others, she understood what she was seeing. Damien's eyes followed Grace when she walked away. Margaret treated her with unmistakable affection. He was not returning because of the food. He was returning because of Grace. Something bitter settled behind Vanessa's smile. Later, the restaurant owner invited employees onto the small stage to thank everyone who had organized the fundraiser. Grace remained near the back, hoping to avoid attention. Vanessa lifted the microphone. "Grace, don't hide. Come up here where everyone can see you." Applause left Grace. Little choice. She stepped forward, smoothing her apron nervously. Vanessa placed an arm around her shoulders. "Everyone loves Grace," she announced. More applause followed, and Grace smiled, embarrassed but grateful. Then Vanessa laughed. "Although I keep telling her that if she wants to represent this restaurant properly, she might want to spend a little less time tasting the desserts." A few people laughed automatically before realizing what she meant. Grace's smile disappeared. Vanessa continued. "Presentation matters in hospitality. Some of us work very hard to maintain a certain image." Her eyes traveled deliberately over Grace's curvy body. Of course, Grace has never seemed worried about that. The room became quieter. Grace felt heat climb into her face. She could have survived the joke. She had survived worse. But Vanessa had found an audience, and cruelty becomes bolder when it thinks people are listening. "Then again," Vanessa added sweetly, glancing toward Damien, "I suppose confidence comes easily when certain wealthy customers are willing to overlook appearances." The implication landed harder than the insult. Grace felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, then toward Damien. For a second she was no longer standing in the restaurant. She was 16 again, hearing classmates whisper that no boy would want a girl her size. She was 20, wenta, listening to a coworker suggest she belonged in the kitchen instead of serving customers. She remembered the man who once asked for the prettier waitress, while she stood close enough to hear him. Years of smiling, ignoring, forgiving, and pretending suddenly pressed against her chest at once. Vanessa had not created the wound. She had simply found the oldest one and opened it in front of everyone. Grace looked down. Not because she believed Vanessa, but because she was tired of proving that kindness could exist inside a body. People felt entitled to judge. Tired of being expected to laugh when humiliation was disguised as humor. Yet even then, Grace refused to give Vanessa another victim. She did not insult her. She did not cry into the microphone. She quietly reached for the serving tray she had placed beside the stage, intending to return to work and protect everyone else's evening from becoming uglier. Across the room, Margaret's gentle expression vanished. She looked at Grace, then at her son. Damien had not moved. His face revealed nothing, but his hand had tightened around the edge of the table. Margaret knew that stillness. Executives knew it. Men who had underestimated Damien DeLuca knew it too. His silence was never weakness. It was the moment before a decision became irreversible. Margaret reached across and touched his hand. Damien looked at his mother. She did not need to sign a single word. He released the table, rose slowly from his chair, and buttoned his jacket. One by one, nearby conversations died. Grace looked up as Damien began walking toward the stage. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Vanessa at all. His eyes remained on Grace. And as the most powerful man in the room crossed the floor toward the woman everyone had just watched being humiliated, even those who did not know Damien DeLuca understood one thing. Vanessa's joke had just become a mistake she could never take back. Every conversation in the ballroom faded as Damien DeLuca crossed the floor. Grace watched him approach, holding the serving tray against her body. Vanessa stood beside the microphone, her smile stiffening with every step. Damien did not look angry. That was what made the room feel colder. Men who knew him understood he rarely raised his voice when furious. He became quieter, more precise, final. When he reached the stage, he stopped beside Grace and held out his hand. She stared at it. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Damien's gaze stayed on hers. "I know. That's exactly why I will." Grace slowly placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers around it gently, not like a man claiming possession, but like someone making one thing clear: she would not stand alone. Then Damien turned toward Margaret. Instead of speaking, he raised his free hand and began to sign. Grace froze. His American sign language was slower than hers, but careful and sincere. "Mother," he signed, "this is the woman I told you about." Margaret rose with tears already gathering in her eyes. "Yes," she answered. "She is exactly who I hoped she would be." Most guests understood no signs, yet no translation was needed to understand the tenderness between mother and son. Grace felt her throat tighten. Damien had never told her he had been watching from the beginning. Then he faced the room. "Several weeks ago, my mother came into this restaurant alone." A few guests glanced toward Margaret. "She is deaf." That night, some people grew impatient because she did not answer them. Others laughed. One man waved his hands in her face. Another mocked a language he did not understand. The warmth drained from the room. Grace remembered Margaret's careful smile and trembling hands. Damien continued, "I was standing near the entrance. I saw everything, and I saw the only person who stepped between my mother and that cruelty." Grace turned toward him. Grace did not know who Margaret DeLuca was. She did not know my name. She did not know whether my family had money, influence, or anything to offer her. She asked for nothing. She simply saw an elderly woman being treated as though her silence made her less human, and she refused to allow it. Margaret lowered her head, fighting tears. Damien's voice softened. "My family has spent years paying for the best care available. Assistants, translators, private services. We could buy comfort. We could buy convenience. But money could not buy what Grace gave my mother that night." He looked toward Margaret, then back at Grace. She gave her dignity without making her ask for it. A woman near the front wiped her eyes. "Tonight, we gathered here to raise money in the name of kindness. We applaud generosity when it happens on a stage. We put names on donor walls. But kindness means very little if we only practice it when important people are watching." Damien finally looked at Vanessa. Grace was kind when she believed no one important was watching. He turned back to the room. "She spoke my mother's language. She made her laugh. And when my mother told her she had forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere, Grace said, 'You always belong here.'" Grace's eyes burned. She had never imagined those words would return to her like this. Damien tightened his hand around hers. "There are people here tonight with wealth, titles, companies, influence. None of that makes us better than the waitress standing beside me." He paused. "The only person here who deserves applause is the woman who made my mother feel heard without ever hearing her voice." For one heartbeat, the ballroom remained still. Then Margaret began clapping. Slowly, proudly. The elderly veteran Grace had helped Rose next. The Friday night couple stood. Kitchen staff appeared near the serving doors, applauding. One table rose, then another, until the ballroom was on its feet. Grace covered her mouth. She had spent years believing people noticed her body before anything else. Now the same room that had watched her humiliation was standing because they had finally seen her heart. Vanessa remained frozen near the microphone. When the applause faded, she forced out a laugh. I was only joking. The restaurant owner stepped onto the stage, his expression grave. No, Vanessa. You were humiliating one of the finest employees I have. She started to protest, but he removed the event badge from her jacket. This charity exists because we believe every guest deserves dignity. Tonight, you violated that value. You no longer represent this restaurant. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. No one defended her. Grace did not celebrate. She only looked exhausted, overwhelmed by the attention. Damien turned toward her. You didn't have to change your evening because of me, she said softly. He gave her a small smile. I changed it because someone needed to remind this room what strength looks like. Grace swallowed. And what does real strength look like? Damien looked directly into her eyes. It looks like a woman who chooses kindness after the world has given her every reason to become bitter. The words reached somewhere applause never could. Yet as Grace stood beneath the lights, one truth remained painfully untouched. Being seen by everyone else was not the same as believing she deserved to be seen at all. Hours after the charity dinner ended, Grace was still inside the restaurant folding tablecloths and stacking chairs. Work usually quieted her mind, but tonight every movement seemed to bring back Vanessa's words, the standing ovation, and Damien's hand closing around hers. She still could not understand how the quiet man she had spent weeks calling Soup Guy could command an entire ballroom without raising his voice. When headlights swept across the windows, Grace looked outside and saw Damien beside a black sedan. Margaret waited inside. Grace stepped into the cold Chicago night, pulling her coat tighter. I thought powerful businessmen had people to drive away dramatically after events like this. Damien almost smiled. Usually. Then his expression changed. Grace, I owe you the truth. She folded her arms. I was wondering when we'd get there. You know I'm chairman of DeLuca Enterprises. Everyone in that room made sure I learned that tonight. There's more. Something in his voice erased her smile. Damien looked toward the street before meeting her eyes again. My family has another life. A complicated one. There are people in this city who fear the DeLuca name for reasons that have nothing to do with corporate boardrooms. There are decisions I make that never appear in newspapers, and responsibilities I cannot pretend are ordinary. Grace studied him. He did not boast. He did not romanticize danger, or offer details designed to impress her. He was not showing her his power. He was warning her about its weight. So the man I've been teasing about tomato soup is one of the most feared men in Chicago, she asked. Yes. Grace stared at him, then gave a disbelieving laugh. I called you Mr. Soup Guy. Repeatedly. And you never corrected me. I liked it. Her laughter faded as the distance between their lives suddenly became impossible to ignore. She looked down at the apron, still tied beneath her coat. Damien, people like us don't belong in the same story. His brow tightened. Why? You have boardrooms. I carry dinner plates. You walk into rooms and people already know your name. I work double shifts, so I can pay my bills. She swallowed. People expect someone like you to stand beside a certain kind of woman. Damien understood where this was going, and for once he wished he did not. Grace continued before courage abandoned her. Someone elegant, thin, someone who looks like she belongs in your world. Vanessa's cruelty had ended hours ago, but the older voices remained. I've spent enough of my life hearing that I'm too big, too ordinary, too much of the wrong things. I don't want to wake up one day and discover you finally see what everyone else saw first. Damien said nothing. The ballroom had applauded Grace. He had defended her. Vanessa was gone. None of it had reached the wound that mattered most. The world had finally seen Grace Bennett, but Grace still could not see herself through anything except the eyes of those who had hurt her. Damien stepped closer. This time, power would be useless. If he wanted Grace to believe she belonged beside him, he would have to answer her in the language that had begun everything. Damien stepped closer. But instead of answering Grace with the polished certainty that had ended negotiations and silenced boardrooms, he slowly raised his hands. Grace's breath caught. His first sign was careful, almost hesitant. Thank you. She stared at him. Damien continued, his American Sign Language imperfect, but unmistakably sincere. For my mother. Grace felt the wall she had been trying to build between them begin to weaken. He lowered his hands only when he knew she understood. Do you know how many things I tried to give her after my father died? He asked quietly. Doctors, assistants, private drivers, interpreters. Anything money could provide, I provided. He glanced toward Margaret waiting inside the sedan. But somewhere along the way, I started solving problems instead of understanding what she had actually lost. She didn't need another person managing her life. She needed to feel like she still belonged in it. Grace's eyes filled. You gave her that before you knew her last name. Before you knew mine. You gave her dignity without making her feel grateful for receiving it. Grace looked away. Anyone should have done what I did. But they didn't. Damien's answer came without hesitation. You did. The street was quiet around them, washed in the amber glow of the restaurant sign. Grace folded her arms as if she could hold herself together. That doesn't change how different we are. No, Damien said. It doesn't. She looked at him, surprised. He did not offer the comforting lie she expected. Our worlds are different. There will be people who judge you. There will be people who judge me. There are parts of my life I wish were simpler. He paused. But none of that gives strangers the right to decide where you belong. Grace swallowed. And what happens when you decide they were right? Damien's expression softened. Grace, I noticed your heart before I knew how much I liked your smile. I respected you before I realized I was attracted to you. And I was already looking for excuses to see you before I admitted what any of it meant. A tear slipped down her cheek. Damien smiled faintly. Which brings us to the soup. Grace laughed despite herself. Of course it does. The first evening I came back, the tomato basil soup really was excellent. I knew it. You're going to ruin this confession. Continue, Mr. Soup Guy. He laughed, then looked at her with a tenderness that erased the humor from her face. But every day after that, I came back for you. Grace went still. I came back because you made my mother laugh. Because you remembered everyone's name. Because you treated a homeless man, paying with coins, with the same respect you gave customers, leaving $100 tips. I came back because every room I've entered my entire life changes when people learn who I am. His voice lowered. They become quieter, more careful, sometimes afraid. He stepped closer. But every room you enter becomes warmer, simply because you're there. Grace could no longer hide her tears. Damien, I've spent my life building an empire, he said. You've spent yours building people. I know which one matters more. For several seconds, Grace could hear nothing except her own breathing. All her life, love had seemed conditional. Something waiting on the other side of becoming thinner, prettier, more successful, more acceptable. Yet Damien was not promising to rescue her from being Grace Bennett. He was asking her to believe that Grace Bennett was already enough. I'm still afraid, she whispered. So am I. That answer surprised her most. You? Power doesn't make a man fearless. It only gives him more things he can lose. Damien reached for her hand. And I don't want to lose this because we were too frightened to find out what it could become. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back at the man she had once believed returned every night for tomato soup. You make it very difficult to argue with you. I've had excellent motivation. What motivation? Damien smiled. You. Grace laughed through her tears and rested her forehead against his. Inside the sedan, Margaret watched them with shining eyes. For once, Damien did not feel like the chairman of an empire, or the man people whispered about in Chicago. He felt like a son whose mother was happy, and a man standing beside the woman he loved. He had spent his life believing power meant having somewhere to rule. Grace was teaching him that love meant finally having somewhere to belong. And neither of them knew yet that the simple act that had brought them together was about to give thousands of others that same chance. 6 months later, the ballroom inside the DeLuca Foundation looked nothing like the restaurant where everything had begun. Hundreds of restaurant owners, hotel managers, nurses, emergency responders, and community volunteers filled the room beneath banners, carrying one simple message: every voice deserves to be understood. At the front stood Grace Bennett, no longer carrying dinner plates, but serving people in a way that felt even more deeply her own. As the Foundation's Director of Community Outreach, she had transformed one painful evening into a citywide American Sign Language initiative, offering free ASL training to workers who met deaf and hard of hearing people every day. Margaret sat proudly in the front row as servers practiced welcoming guests. Nurses learned how to introduce themselves, and hotel employees stumbled through their first imperfect signs. Watching them, she remembered the lonely dinners when people had spoken around her instead of to her. Now an entire room was learning to do better. A reporter approached Damien near the stage. "What first made you notice Grace?" Damien looked across the ballroom. Grace was laughing while correcting a young waiter's hand position, still wearing the same warm expression she had worn the night his mother entered that little Chicago restaurant. "Everyone else saw a waitress," he said. "My mother saw someone who spoke her language." His gaze softened. "I saw the woman who changed both our lives." Later, Grace walked to Margaret and raised her hands. No speech was necessary. "We're family now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Always." Grace embraced her as Damien watched from across the room. Months earlier, Grace had told a lonely woman, "You always belong here." She had spent her life giving others that feeling, without realizing how desperately she needed it herself. Now she finally understood. Kindness had not merely brought Damien into her life. It had led Grace home.